and welcome back to the Baseball Development Hub podcast. My name is Trevor Powers, and for anybody watching on video, you'll notice that I am not joined today by co-host Dan Galati. Instead, we have a very special guest. For anybody who's been a fan of Backside Ground Balls Media for an extended period of time, it is the co-host of The Trail, which if you haven't checked out the Trail episodes, head back to the Backside Ground Balls Media YouTube channel, podcast platforms, ton of awesome recruiting information, right? Which obviously is a big part of the process for so many high school players as well as parents wanting to be educated. But Sam, before we get into all that, I appreciate it. Feels like old times.
Yes, sir. It's good to be back on here with you and talk about some recruiting. So appreciate it, Trevor.
Yep, of course. Well, we're excited to get into it, a ton of different topics. For those that were around, the last time they probably heard from you, you were college sports advisors. Now you're with Rockland Peak Performance. So really exciting times to obviously get the connections that RPP has on the player development side and things like that. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about maybe the transition, about how that's gone and kind of what you guys offer at RPP before we get into the nitty gritty of what the recruiting process and what this calendar looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I am the Director of Recruiting and Sales at RPP Baseball. We are a player development facility in Bergen County, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. So up in the northeast portion of the state, we have really a full offering to players at all different levels. We have some professional guys that are in the facility during the off season, as well as college guys throughout the different points on the calendar. And then obviously, the high school and youth demographic is a big segment of the population that's in the building day to day. And it's really about complete player development, from strength training to speed work, hitting, pitching, all the different touch points that any competitive player needs to reach their full potential. On the recruiting side, we have RPP Recruiting, which is a advisory service for prospective college players that are looking to maximize the process and find their fit at the next level. We have a couple of different offerings. I would tell anybody that's interested in either a conversation or looking at the different things that we provide to players and families to jump on our website. It is right there at RPP Baseball. You can click on the recruiting tab, and there's some really good information. So go ahead and check that out if it's something that you'd like to learn more about.
Yeah, and I'll go out on a ledge and say it. I think you're one of the best in the industry nationwide.
I appreciate
so
that.
Even if you're not in the New Jersey area and you're looking to pick somebody's brain and help with this process, I don't think there's anybody better that you can go to and rely on. And this is going to kind of feel like a layup question, but to a certain extent, how important is the player development element of the recruiting process, right? Which I think is what's really cool about what you're doing at RPP, is having both avenues, because from a former college coach's perspective and talking to college coaches, if you're not good enough, you're not going to get recruited, right? So how nice is it to kind of have all of that under one umbrella where you can get the people that you're working with the player development needs they need, but also help them on the recruiting element?
For sure. And we're going to talk about it, in the course of this conversation. But, with the roster reduction, the trickle effect, that's being felt throughout college baseball, I think the talent bar has been raised at every level of the sport right now. So in order to match that as a high school recruit, you better be talented, right? And that starts with the things that you're doing in the player development space. I think personally, as an advisor, the information that we now have access to, from our evaluation process at the very beginning of the working relationship with the player, all the way through, the entirety of that working relationship, really allows us to impact them to the best of our ability, and make sure that we're constantly having a very good understanding of where the skill set is at, the things that we can do to enhance it, and that really being a huge net positive into the recruiting process, right? At the end of the day, it's a skill evaluation, and the more skill you have is going to increase your opportunity. So everything needs to be, really thought through that perspective. And, if we can solidify the foundation of that player, right, through, strength and movement, speed, power, obviously into the skill set, we feel like we're setting them up to achieve at their highest level at all points in the recruiting process and really beyond, right? Because ultimately, now that you've committed, hopefully, right, what comes next and getting to campus as prepared as you can be is obviously instrumental as well.
Yeah, as I always tell athletes or anybody in general, everybody who commits to a school thinks they're going to be conference player of the year at said school, right? You want to go and perform,
Sure.
right? The commitment is just the dopamine hit on Instagram when you post the graphic, but that's the beginning of the process. Anybody who's gotten to the
Certainly.
end of it, playing college sports or really even going to college, choosing your college is simply just a part of the long-term plan, right? And when we get to the other side, we don't remember that day and how we felt when we committed. We remember the memories that we had and specifically performing and being on the field each and every day at said program. So you mentioned it,
No doubt.
roster changes, scholarship changes. What's the new landscape look like? Because even since the last time we had a conversation, so much has changed. There's a lot more clarity on how many roster spots there are. There's opt-ins, opt-outs. So just give our listeners an overview of what conversations are like with coaches, how you're navigating the process with parents and players, and ensuring that kids are finding the best opportunities for themselves.
For sure. So there's definitely some more clarity, compared to where things were at, to begin the calendar year. I think there's still a sense of some unknowns, right? And that's continuing to create um, an atmosphere in recruiting where college coaches are having to adapt, right? Yes, right, for schools that have opted in to revenue sharing at the Division 1 level, you have 34 roster spots, but then this summer we get the DSA tag, right, designated student athlete, and that's now increased roster limits. So it continues to evolve. I think from a player family perspective, the things that you need to be most aware of are the fact that less high school players are being recruited at the Division 1 level than ever before. Right, all these classes have decreased in overall number. Right, and obviously, um, different programs have varying philosophies in terms of how they're trying to construct their roster. Um, Keep in mind, everybody recruits the transfer portal outside of the Ivy League, the military academies. You simply have to have a team, right, at this point in the calendar, right? September, when fall ball begins, you got to have guys on your depth chart that go help win games this year. So as you lose guys at the end of the prior season, you need to find ways to replace them. So the transfer portal is a pivotal aspect of that, and with the volatility of roster movement, I think the biggest thing you see in the summer is just that being such a focus for college coaches. Right, they're having to get out and recruit the Cape, the NECBL, the Northwoods, different entities like that, where in prior years, they would spend time on the road evaluating and recruiting high school players. So they're just getting pulled in more directions. As a result of that, it's slowing the process down. I think right now, if you look at, the 2027 class, so those are high school juniors, post August 1st, we didn't see the volume of commitments that you saw in years past once recruiting opened up for that class. I think that's a result of less spots, but then also, again, coaches not having probably as much evaluation done on some of those guys because they spent so much of June trying to construct next year's roster. So all these things have, kind of a cascading effect on the entirety of the process. I think, more so than ever, it's something that, if you go back and you listen to, some of the old episodes, right, we always stressed fit and the opportunity to, have a pathway to playing time, from a athletic standpoint. And I think that's more important than ever because, if you're getting either recruited on top of or left behind, ultimately, it's going to be really tough to kind of reset your career in most circumstances. So by getting on the field first, right, it's going to enhance your experience, right? Everybody wants to play. You're there to play in the uniform, not just wear it. But then, it just gives you options going forward, whether, hey, this is the best place for me and it's an opportunity maybe to increase my financial opportunity at that institution, whether that's through NIL or through additional scholarship opportunities, or maybe look towards the portal and see if the grass is greener in another area. So I think that you really have to focus on that. At the end of the day, when you really start to now think about the decision making of the recruiting process, understanding what you're committing to is imperative because, like you said, between the roster changes, DSA tag, the different types of financial packages that are being put out there across the sport right now, really having a good understanding of that, and whether you're relying on your travel ball coach, your high school coach, somebody in your circle. I think it's super important, as a player and family, to have a very in-depth knowledge of that and what the landscape is like, so that you're informed and ultimately making the best decision for your future.
100%. And I couldn't agree more with everything you said there. I'm going to ask you a question that maybe somebody listening to this, or a lot of parents probably ask on the initial phone call when they get on the phone with you and are trying to gather some information about the process. The big picture narrative for people, especially on the outside of the sport, is that the transfer portal has ruined high school recruiting, right? And obviously there's pros and cons. It's a lot more at the Division I level, and those conversations that definitely come into play. What is kind of your perspective on that conversation, maybe easing a parent's concerns or maybe opening their mind up to, hey, it has changed the sport at the top of Power Four, but there's still thousands of schools that are fresh for opportunities for your son specifically to play college baseball?
Yeah, well, I say this to our players all the time, right? Like, nobody cares about my opinion, but the fact of the matter is this is the landscape we're operating in. Um, Obviously, the high school player has been dramatically affected, over the last few years when it comes to the recruiting process. But having said that, look, every program in America is still recruiting high school players, right? Even at the top of the sport, the SEC, the ACC, the Power Four programs, they're recruiting high school players. So it's still occurring, right? The most talented guys in America are ending up at the highest level of the sport. So we haven't seen anybody, at least to my knowing, um, you know, fully move on from recruiting high school players. So, there is a pathway to college baseball. It has just become more competitive because these classes are smaller as a result of smaller rosters. You also have guys getting to campus, whether it's NIL, taking them out of the draft, either on the back end, right, year four, right. Maybe traditionally somebody was signing for a mid-range bonus, but you know they're able to either equal or in some cases enhance their financial opportunity by staying on campus for a fourth year, or guys deciding to attend school because the financial prospects are so good over the course of a 3-year period. So there's definitely an effect there. Again, at the highest level of the sport, where the draft is a influence on roster decisions. But then again, it's that domino effect. But um, ultimately, I think this ties back to something we were saying earlier, Trevor. The biggest decisions you're making in the recruiting process really are the player development aspects of what you're doing, throughout the course of the calendar. And I think this is something that I think is not necessarily a good thing, but I think it has pulled players in a direction where it just requires more investment financially, yes, but a time investment to really um, physically develop, because you just have to be more prepared to step on campus day one. I think in a 40-man roster situation, the ability to recruit a few guys that are maybe a year or two away from helping you, it just doesn't happen anymore, particularly at the Division I level. And that's really where things need to, I think that the mindset needs to shift for players and families in terms of you really have to be, I don't want to say a complete player, but you have to be further along in your development from a physical standpoint, skill perspective, and then the game environment as well. The guys who were super toolsy, but maybe couldn't put it together day in and day out between the white lines, like those guys are still, not as attractive in today's recruiting landscape because we can go and get the kid who's been on a Division 2 or Division 3 roster for 2 years who can do all of that, right? He just checks more boxes. So you really have to have all those elements, I think, in order to, at least at the Division 1 level right now, be a competitive recruit.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of want to let that simmer. If anybody's listening to this right now, go back 30 seconds, re-listen to that. The floor of what you have to be to play college baseball is much higher. As roster sizes decrease, I
Absolutely.
can't emphasize this enough. You cannot take as much of a chance on 97's a stretch, 92 all over the place. Back in the day, if you had good stuff but you couldn't throw strikes, they could put you on ice, red shirt you, put you in a developmental track, and you're an ace by year 3 potentially. With roster sizes decreasing, with arm injuries being what they are, all the factors that are in play, we'd rather have a guy who throws 86 in the strike zone, because when we're down 7 on a Tuesday in some random town, we just need a guy to go out there to eat innings, right?
Sure.
Because we only have 34, right? And I know with DSAs it's a little tricky and things like that. So the developmental aspect, right? I always talk about this with, I always used to say it's not your grandfather's college baseball, right? The beauty of this
For
sport is you
sure.
could have a 90-mile-per-hour arm. I'm sure you've seen this, who ends up at a really good Division 3 school. When I was being recruited in 2015, if you threw 90, don't even worry about reaching out to Division 2 schools, right? Like,
Sure.
it was just so commonplace for those guys to be automatic Division 1 players because of how talented everybody is and raising the floor of what expectations are. So even if your cousin played at, I always use the example around here, NC State, and you feel like your son's a better player than said cousin, that doesn't mean he's even going to play Division 1 baseball in this landscape. How do you keep families open minded to understanding that the floor of what the expectations are of being able to be a rostered Division 1 player, and really a rostered even Division 3 player, has risen so much, to make sure expectations are set in stone so that people don't get just spending, I mean, time's valuable, where they're spending time going to camps, showcases, emailing the wrong level of coaches.
Sure. I think it's a lot of conversations like this and just making sure there's an awareness from a parent player perspective in terms of what the landscape is like. Um, I think there's a lot of there's some bad information out there, but there's also a lot of good information out there for uh, recruits to get a sense of what they're going to encounter in the process, and then ultimately at the college level in the years ahead. Um, you know, for us, at least personally speaking on our end, it's why the evaluation is so critical. And being able to have a very candid conversation with players, and yeah, maybe the ceiling and the floor is a little bit more wide ranging than it was in the past because of all these different factors. But I still think you need to have a sense of really where the player is at the beginning of the conversation, and then what does that project to in the years ahead, and what can you do from a advisory standpoint to benefit that player, right? And certain things need to be prioritized, right, based on that evaluation. Is it a strength deficit? Is it a physical, does he need to add more mass, right? Like, we talk about it quite frequently with younger high school players, but you don't see a lot of 160-pound guys playing Division 1 baseball right now, right? The sport's more physical than it's ever been before. So these are all things that, you need to be aware of, and ultimately players need to have a really good understanding of what the requirements are in order to best put themselves in a situation to get recruited. And then, like I said, I think it's just about being a more complete player in the recruiting process than ever before. And I think it's also access to information, right? Like those things necessarily weren't available to coaches in the past, but whether it's, you know, um, ability to consume, you know, data, right, from a TrackMan or a Rapsodo, even, the social media entity, and being able to pop a kid's name into, Twitter and look at what their outings might have been like throughout the course of the summer. There's just so much more information for these guys to do a deep dive into players and really get a more complete sense, rather than just the three outings that they've evaluated in person. And on their end, with the tough decisions that they have to make, it requires that attention to detail. And I think as a player, it puts a magnifying glass on everything that you do, and it's tough, right? Because I just look at, like, guys up here in the Northeast, for example, right? And let's use a hitter as an example, right? You show up in you know mid March and you got to start playing high school games in 40-degree weather, and the strike zone is uh, you know stretching
Chalk to
into
chalk.
the opposite batter's box and things of that nature. And you look up, and maybe some of the offensive numbers are down across the spring and just took you a little bit of time to get going, but that information's out there, right? And coaches are looking towards it to, again, make the most informed decision, because in a 6-person high school class, and that's pretty commonplace at Division I right now. Um, it again, you can't take as much of a chance on guys, and it just puts a lot of emphasis on the player being prepared at all points in the calendar to, again, best position themselves for success in the process ahead.
Mhm. You hit on it a couple times there. You mentioned, coaches making decisions off of information gathered, data points, and things like that. One of the things you probably hear the most in the recruiting industry is my son doesn't check the metric box that schools are looking for, but they're a really good baseball player, right? And it's one of my favorite things to hear, because not that I roll my eyes at it, because I don't think all coaches recruit solely off of metrics like a lot of the private sector would have you believe. But metrics are valuable information, and data is information. And when we're making decisions, we want the most information as possible. Talk a little bit about how metrics go into your evaluation and how you guide parents and families through the process of being able to have their outreach be very important. And one of the things I specifically want you to hit on, because you said it to me one time and you probably don't even remember saying this, but it turned a light bulb off in my brain, and it's stuck with me ever since. Size and strength is a metric as well, right? So even if your kid's
Sure.
really good and he's hitting 550 in high school baseball and he has great bat to ball and things like that, but if he's 5'6", 160 pounds, like you hit on at the beginning of that answer, not many kids that size play Division I baseball. So talk about the importance of metrics and coaches being able to make the best decision possible for them.
Yeah, I think, especially on the pitching side right now, right, data is becoming more prevalent in the recruiting process. Um, I think more times than not, when a coach is recruiting a pitcher in today's landscape, they're asking for data if it's available. Particularly for guys in our program, coaches know we have a TrackMan. Like, they want that information to be able to analyze what the arsenal looks like. Not saying that everything is being decided on those things. It's not professional baseball per se, where there are certain benchmarks that need to be met from an organizational standpoint in order to draft a guy or move him through the system. But I think you're looking for things that maybe you can't get from just evaluating a bullpen, to see if there's outlier information that is going to separate that arm from the rest of the guys that you're recruiting. Positionally, I would say it's um, it's not as part of the conversation, but I always use the metrics as kind of a barrier to entry, right? Um, Again, not everybody's going to fit into a nice clean box, but most guys are going to meet certain benchmarks from a metric perspective at different levels of the sport, right? You look at guys who are going to play in the middle of the field at a top 50 program, they're usually 6'6", 6'8" runners, right? Um, so I think you use those to kind of organize your thinking and try and set the player up on a pathway towards programs that are going to be viable, right? Whether that's the 60 arm strength, some exit velocities, things of that nature, bat speed. But again, you then have to have those tools. And when we talk about the complete player, those have to translate into the game setting, right? Um, so I think that's most important on the position player side. But it's really about getting organized because, you know, from a strategic standpoint, as a player in a family, as you attack the recruiting process in today's world, you need to be more precise and calculated than ever before, because as these classes have shrunk, you can't fall back as much to a smaller Division One program because those spots have usually been taken, right? By the time you get to a period where you think you're now ready to be recruited by those schools. So you really need to go after the top targets based on the evaluation from day one and secure your opportunities. And I think that's imperative right now as a player and family. And if you don't have a good evaluation, and sometimes using again the metrics and the data helps kind of point you in that direction, you can get very lost. Or you can get lost very easily, I should say, and ultimately you look up and a lot of opportunities passed you by because you were trying to play kind of above your means to a certain extent.
I think barrier for entry is such a great way to say that, just from my perspective on the former coach side of, you could go out and pitch to a sub 1 ERA, but if you're 68 to 72, there's
Right.
just a level that velocity doesn't play at. Now, Dan and I
Sure.
spent time on this podcast right here talking about velocity training and bat speed and not intentionally just focusing on those things for development, because 97 with a 0% in zone rate is bad, right? There's no way to say it.
Certainly.
But there is a barrier for entry. That doesn't mean 76 in the strike zone is good, right?
Right.
Because there is a balance between the two. And I think that's a really important piece to realize is, from the metric standpoint, is coaches still need to see things like baseball IQ, throwing to the right base, instinctual bat to ball skills, all of those things that check boxes to prove that you're able to play at said level. But
For
without
sure.
that barrier to entry, you're never going to enter the conversation to get evaluated at the school that you're hoping to get to. So I know there's really no question off of that, but do you kind of have anything to build off of what I just said there?
Well, I think the other part that needs to be mentioned here is coaches are evaluating you and trying to say, how does this skill set fit into our roster, our level of play, right? And you need to understand that the speed of the game, the things that you're required to do at the next level are far greater than what you're playing at right now. You can go and watch the most competitive summer ball game. Pick shoot, right? We're a few weeks out from WWBA in Jupiter, right? The kind of the crown jewel of travel baseball. Um, there's going to be some really high level games that take place at that event. It still doesn't match the level that's going to be required even at a mid-major Division One conference game in the spring. So coaches aren't just looking at how you're doing on the field that they're evaluating you on. They're trying to now take that skill set into their conference, right? Can you help us win games on a Saturday in the spring? And um, again, most of their roster is going to be comprised of guys with a certain level of skill set. Obviously, the metrics and the data are part of that. You then again have to be able to go and do those things, between the white lines when the game's being played. But it's really the combination of those two things that are going to allow you to ultimately succeed at the next level.
Yeah, I mean, there's examples across the country every year where kid, your son may lead the team in batting average and is only getting Division 3 interest, and a kid who's hitting 100 points lower. is getting a ton of Division I interest. And I feel like that happens a lot in a sport like baseball, where it's not all just size and strength and I can move you out of the way. A well offensive lineman can move a defensive lineman out of the way, and running back hits the hole, runs faster than everybody, touchdown, right? Easy enough to see that on the field. There's a lot more nuance in baseball. And just because you hit 500 or you got to hit off of a Division I commit doesn't mean that said school should be interested in you, because there are barriers of entry.
Yeah, the transitive property does not apply to the recruiting process. I got to hit off of, a power four committed arm. Therefore, I'm a power four hitter. That is the worst argument to make. That's a huge pet peeve of mine. So, yeah, it just doesn't apply. Again, there's a lot of things that can happen on any given day that the best players consistently play at a high level. That's what makes them special.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, but I chuckle. I'm sure if there's somebody listening being like, I don't think people actually, people say that. People
Oh
100%
yes,
say that if I got to hit off of a Rutgers can commit for your neck of the woods, that I should
yep.
be recruited by Rutgers. And it's just not fully the case.
For sure. Go through Twitter in the spring or the summer and watch the mentions of here's a double versus a, you know, XYZ commit. So,
Mm-hmm.
look, obviously, uh, you know, performing versus top competition is important. It's a big proving ground, but one swing versus a particular arm isn't going to be, the culmination of the recruiting process for you as a player.
Yeah, 100%. And where we're going to go into now a little bit more is specific towards the year of recruiting, right? And for those that are new to this or new to our conversations, again, when Sam and I first started doing the trail, we basically made a playlist of how to's, right? How to send an email, how to go to the right showcases and things like that. So if you're really looking for the nitty gritty details of what the recruiting process looks like and what the advice is from Sam specifically, again, I can't emphasize that enough to head back, check out that playlist. It's still on the YouTube channel. It's still on the podcast platform. We haven't pulled it down. So make sure you go into that. So if you want to know how Trevor, ask about writing an email, we've got that information for you. We're not going to spend time doing that today. But one of the things that I always love
I would
to yes,
say,
you go.
real quick, Trevor, just mention, we've talked about a lot of change, right? I think that's a theme of the conversation we're having on this episode. But when it relates to, the playlist of different things that we, talked in depth about, whether it was a skills video, game tape, how to construct an email, a lot of that is very similar even in today's recruiting landscape. So I think that's a super valuable tool for people that are interested, in listening. I think you'll be able to really find a lot of action points for your own process in there, and would encourage you to give it a listen.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. I think when we recorded it, our intention was to stay evergreen through change, right? It
Right,
wasn't topics that were catered to January of 2024, right? Like we wanted
right,
it to be something that was specific to how to go through the recruiting process, no matter when you listen to this. And that was the foundation of what we wanted to do. But one of the beautiful things about that I like to have conversations about is the time on the calendar that we're in. As we record this, it's
sure.
September 26th. And specifically with the 2026 class, I think fall is crunch time for a lot of those players that maybe haven't gotten the process to go the way they'd like. What's your conversation like if a kid is uncommitted? What are 2026s typically doing for the uncommitted? Obviously, the committed ones are pretty self explanatory. What's your advice to an uncommitted 2026 who the process hasn't gone exactly as they intended when they started?
Yeah, I would say there's still opportunity out there for 2026s. You're not in a situation where college baseball's passed you by. I think you just need to be um, very candid with yourself in terms of where you fit. Right? If you've played all summer and you've had exposure to Division One schools, and maybe you've camped at a couple of those programs, and you don't have an offer or on the verge of an offer, you really need to start to focus on Division Two and Division Three programs. A lot of those places are having camps here throughout the course of October and November. They're in their decision mode, and you don't want the process to pass you by. So I think you really need to start to identify some fits at those levels, attack them aggressively. And I would say camps are probably the best way to do that. I think fall recruiting, for the most part, has definitely fallen off a little bit in recent years, just because um, the roster volatility, right, that we talked about, right? Like I was on the phone with an ACC assistant coach a few weeks ago. I was asking them, "Hey, are you guys going to be in Fort Myers for WWA underclass?" And he's like, "We simply can't do it. Like we can't leave for Fort Myers and then go to Jupiter the week after." He's like, "We've got so many new guys on campus. Like we got to coach our players right now. That's the biggest focal point." So obviously, that's at the top of the sport, but I think it holds true through the different levels and different type of programs that are out there. So I think the best way in the fall is to go to them and guarantee yourself an audience with those programs. Um, you know, so do your homework. Make sure you're identifying fits. Maybe you want to reach out with an email to introduce yourself. Ask if they're still recruiting your position, so you're not wasting time at camp, because these D2 and D3 programs have definitely already received some commitments. So you need to, be aware of that. But I think that's definitely where things are at with the 2026 class. At this point in the calendar.
100%. And I mean, fall prospect camps are great opportunities for Division III schools to go, oh, that kid's in our neck of the woods, and I had no idea he was there. I think it's a great opportunity to get right in front of those coaches with an opportunity to potentially get recruited and find that spot that you're looking for. And again, the process isn't over. It might seem bleak. I think a lot of 2026 is entering this time of year start to get worried that they're never going to meet their dream of playing college baseball. There's still opportunities, and you just have to keep an open mind. You mentioned
Yeah, and look,
August 1st. Yeah, you go. Yeah.
yeah, and I know we've mentioned this in the past, and this will be slanted a little bit towards the Northeast, but I think it applies to different areas of the country as well. But there's so much good ball out there, right? Like you look here, in this region, you have the PSAC, right? You have championship level Division II programs, right? You have here in my home state of New Jersey, Felician just made a great run to the College World Series last year. So you've got you know programs playing at the highest level of the sport. Same thing at the Division III level. Again, slanted here to the Garden State, but you have the NJAC, the Division III conference. I mean, it had 5 teams make the NCAA tournament last year. That's a tremendous competitive level of play, and that's just one conference. You have others here, whether it's the Centennial Conference, the NESCAC, at an extremely high academic, level of institution. But there's so many good programs. Be open minded. Again, find that fit. Get a place where you can have a great experience. Build foundational relationships. Pathway to playing time. Receive a degree that's going to enhance your opportunity going forward with that 40-year plan. If you do all that, I promise you're going to really enjoy your college years as a student athlete.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we could go on for days talking about the lower level of baseball and how quality it is. There's a couple things I would point out. The second you step on campus for your freshman year fall, you're going to realize grown men play Division III baseball too. You're
Oh
going to be like,
yes,
whoa, this is a legit brand of baseball, and you're going to have the utmost respect once you're on a campus facing those guys, being in the same hitting groups with those guys, and seeing what the quality of baseball is. And one of my favorite parts, my plug for Division III baseball as well, is you mentioned the high academics, the Centennials, the NESCAC, all of those different conferences specifically in the Northeast. That's the beauty of Division III baseball, is you can play at a very high level at a program like a Johns Hopkins in the Centennial Conference and get an unbelievable degree. And Johns Hopkins is one
sure.
of hundreds, it feels like, in the Northeast that are private schools with great academics and great degrees that are going to set you up for that 40-year plan at the end of the day. So while there's so many times you circle
And
those
it's a top
Division
10
One
program in
schools,
the country at that level.
exactly, and potentially win a national championship, right? And there's so
Sure.
many schools that check those boxes as well. That's my favorite part about Division III baseball, is if you're a good student and you're serious about baseball, you get the best of both worlds to go to those schools and have a great opportunity to set yourself up for a ton of success. And if you're good enough, right, the opportunities are going to come potentially to play professionally. Kids are drafted out of Division III baseball each and every year. Kids kick up. Those opportunities will be presented to you. If you work your tail off, perform when it matters most, you're going to have opportunities to beyond just the Division III baseball that you're looking at that point in time.
Absolutely.
Let's let's talk a little bit about the 2027s. August 1st is a date that's now synonymous with recruiting, right? It's the day that schools are able to reach out and make
One of my
contact with.
least favorite days on the calendar at this point.
It gets busy, right? It gets real busy for you and a lot
Busy
of
and
stress.
just too much hype. I
Yes.
think you know you see it every year. We have guys that commit in the fall period. So this time point in the calendar to schools that didn't contact them on August 1st, whether that was intentional or just they weren't at that point in the process, the school or the player. It is not. Uh, Schools that don't contact you on August 1st are still allowed to recruit you on August 3rd and September 26th. So it just gets too much hype. I think we saw a de-escalation of that day this year. I think um, both from what we saw internally with our own players and then just talking to college coaches and other people in this space, less outreach, in terms of the volume, less scholarship offers on day one, which was, I think, a good thing. Again, I think caused some uh, pandemonium in some player family households, but I think is a good thing for everybody, for all parties. But yes, we're in this post August 1st world with the 2027 class. I think you're starting to see a lot of the top programs in the country start to collect some commitments in that class. So you're starting to see some movement. I think that obviously the pivotal moment of the fall calendar uh, is the event in Fort Myers in a few weeks. WWBA underclass, obviously, high volume of schools and coaches in attendance. I would tell you, if whether you're maybe starting to have conversations now with coaches or you feel like you're on a potential track to commit inside of this calendar year. And again, that's a very small portion of guys, but for those that are on that pathway, like that's a pretty important event, I would tell you. And then again, similar to what we said with the 2026 is, if you're having intentful, if there's good conversations taking place between you and a college coach, maybe they've seen you already at maybe a summer evaluation or some point here in the fall, and they have a camp over the next few weeks, like that might be a good plan of attack as well. But again, I would tell you, that if you're a guy who his recruitment is going to evolve more into next calendar year, don't be in a rush right now.
Who said a couple months would ruin on-air chemistry? You went right into the question I was going to ask you, whether it was panic time or not, if you hadn't heard from any coaches. And I completely agree, right? It's about opportunity, and sometimes those opportunities come at the most random times. And even if you're good enough,
Sure.
prepared, ready, look great on the field, you can't, like, that's the biggest thing that, and I think you probably experience this a lot. And I don't blame people, right? You want to steer the recruiting process, right? As the player, the parent, and things like that. You want to make a decision on your term. You want to make sure that you're going to these. So it's all happenstance, right? It all happens around when the coach identifies you, when they feel like they
Yeah.
want to push because they could like you on August 1st. No offense, they might have a shortstop who's higher on the board. And they got to get an answer from him first, find out who's recruiting him and calling him on August 1st as
It's
well.
not always a referendum on you. And I think that's
No.
one of the hardest things for players and families to grasp. It's frustrating. I understand that. But there are a lot of good players out there. There's always somebody better. And, sometimes you've done everything that you've needed. Sometimes it's just a circumstance that the coaches want to see a couple other guys on their board before they make a final decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
And offer you. So there's a lot of things at play. Um, at the end of the day, it's the coach's decision to offer a player. You can influence obviously some things in terms of, hey, making sure that you've been identified by that staff, whether it's um, camps, showcases that they're in attendance to, playing in front of them throughout the course of the recruiting calendar, emails, different things again to get in front of them. Obviously, you need to be evaluated in terms of them feeling comfortable to then recruit you. But as you do all of that, that last component is that offer stage. and that's the decision solely of that coaching staff. And um, they're going to move on a time frame and offer the guys that they feel best about having as part of their program.
Mhm. I think, to use an analogy, so many people think they are the sun in the recruiting process and it all revolves and they are the gravitational pull. The reality is the
Sure.
recruiting process is the sun and you're just in outer space hanging out there, right? Hoping
Yep.
for your opportunities to be presented to you. And it starts with the coaches. And again, you're never going to be able to tap into the mind of what a coach exactly thinks about you at that point in time, but it doesn't mean that you're wrong in your interest. It doesn't mean they don't like you. Doesn't mean that they do like you if they haven't reached out, but it doesn't mean that they don't. The process just kind of is fluid. It comes at its own time, and just being patient, but still take, again, I think we said this all the time. We were going to make a shirt that said patiently proactive, right? Be patient,
Exactly.
understand it's a process, but be proactive. Don't sit on your hands and hope just because, you throw a certain mile per hour or anything in general that you're going to get those opportunities.
Yeah. Provided that you're there in your developmental
Yes.
process.
Mm-hmm.
There are guys who are just not ready to be recruited right now, and that's okay. You're going
Mm-hmm.
to need to shift your focus into the off season and make those progressions, whether it's physically, whether it's within your skill set. Maybe it's adding a secondary pitch, right? Whatever the holes are in your game that are preventing you from being recruited. Uh, Maybe it's not time to be identified, right? And you're going to kind of spin your wheels because you're not there. Again, it's why the evaluation is so important. Having people around you that can be honest with you and transparent and understand, right? What are the requirements? Everybody's timing is different in that point. Every year we have guys who end up as Division I commits that weren't ready for the process in the fall of their junior year. So you just need to be patient. You need to understand where you're at, run your own race, and be committed to your journey and not trying to just do things because it's what others are doing.
Yeah. Well, my favorite thing to say is if you're good enough, they're going to find a spot for you. As roster sizes shrink, scholarships become readily available. If you show up on their campus in August of your freshman year of college and you're 95 to 97 in the strike zone, they're going to be like, who are we getting rid of? Because you're on the
Sure,
team, right? So the
sure,
recruiting process is no different, right? If you pop at a certain juncture and you're good enough to play at said school, they're going to find an opportunity for you. Now, spots are limited, and that is a rare case. It doesn't happen the way I'm explaining, where a kid just comes out of the ground 95 to 97, but it's about understanding that the process is where if you're good enough to play at a said school, we're going to find an opportunity for you, and schools are usually going to be open to it, even if it is, again, I'm sure you had some 2026s who committed this past August to Division I schools, right?
absolutely,
Yep.
absolutely.
It happens in its own way. So, lastly, we'll leave on this question as we want to be respectful of your time, but we talked about it off air. If people are enjoying this, make sure to let us know in the comments section. Send us an email. Let us know that you want us to keep going, because it's something that Sam and I have talked about on and off about rekindling this relationship and producing some recruiting content. Everybody else, right? So if you're 2028, 2029, I don't even want to say 2030 because it makes me feel old. If everybody else, right? What's the best thing? Because I think the biggest, and maybe this is a podcast in its own, the biggest worry I have about the recruiting process, and you've seen the MLB now take initiatives to get dead time for evaluators to be out on the road. And obviously
Sure.
there's a really big part of me that hopes college can take the same initiative and ensure that we protect the safety of not ramping up to throw in January when we need a full rest. But that's a conversation for another day. These places that are offering evaluation and showcase opportunities for 2028s and beyond, when our money may be better well spent at an RPP, working with the really intelligent people that can develop the talent and the skills so that when you go out next July to said recruiting event, you're ready. And August 1st of the next year, you're ready. Talk a little bit about what everybody else should be focusing on, especially those that aren't physically checking the boxes necessary to be the level of recruit that they expect at that time.
Yeah, I would say for an advanced 2028, so somebody who's on that, early trajectory in their recruiting process, maybe getting to a camp or two in the next few months does have some value. It puts you on campus. You start to hear some messaging. I think in this, landscape where August 1st is the start, sometimes you can get a little bit sped up. So starting to do some due diligence things uh, earlier in the process, I think has its benefits. But again, that's a probably 1% of the 2028 population out there. I think the others, I think fall ball, particularly, in the northern climate, I think is valuable because we have less game time. So getting some additional innings, some at bats, I think has, you know, um, tremendous value in terms of your development. Right, it's hard to replicate a game setting, but I also think by the time we get to mid October and it's 40 degrees on a Sunday, like probably not the best place, in time to spend your your weekend. So I think getting through the course of the first few weeks of the fall ball season is good. Definitely having a game plan right now of what you're doing in the weight room as they build up towards the off season is critical. And then really at this point, you should be mapping out what November, December, January, February look like, and having a concrete plan in terms of what you're doing on a 6-day work week to maximize the off season ahead. Certainly for any player in high school. And that's obviously going to vary a little bit based on where you are in your growth cycle. But, as we talked about, the process has gotten super competitive. You need to be a complete player. A lot of that evolution happens in the off season.
100%. The question we would get the most is when should I start going to showcases? And my response was always when you're ready.
Sure.
Now, when you're ready is defined differently for each individual based on what you're trying to get out of the recruiting process. So I know it's
Yeah.
very broad, but that's where people like Sam come in, and having trustworthy people that understand the industry, have connections within the industry to have the conversations that need to be had are very important. To have people that you trust that aren't guiding you as a 2028 or even a 2027 and saying, hey, go to this really expensive showcase when you're not ready. If you're not going to
Right.
check the boxes developmentally that you need to check at that point in time, you're probably better off using that financial, because the financial side of it is very important, finances and time, on player development, so that when you go out the next year and showcase your abilities, you're ready.
Couldn't agree more. I think ultimately, as a player and family, seek information, both in terms of the development part of your journey, certainly within the recruiting process, for making the decision, right? The commitment decision. Information is power, and that's certainly relevant at all points in the recruiting process. And just surround yourself with really good people. It's a game changer. Um, you know, as talented as your son might be, there are people who have been through this before, and putting them, in your circle, I think has tremendous value in terms of not so much sometimes, you know, hey, right, my son's going to play Division I baseball or play college baseball, right? The 7% of guys get that opportunity, but really avoiding the hiccups and ensuring that you're going to put yourself in the best place at all points in this process, I think is critical, more so than ever, given everything that we've talked about in this conversation.
100%. And I know you didn't say it. I'll say it. Sam is one of those good people that you want to surround yourself with. The wealth of information and experience that he has is really important. So while you might be new to this, he's
That
seen
just
somebody
means I'm
like your
old, but
son.
I appreciate it.
Of course, in a nice way, right? It's a nice way of saying you're old.
Yeah,
But if your son is in a situation and you've never navigated this process, he's probably had a player that's been similarly metrically, physically, skill wise, school, academic fit, financial fit. He's seen it all, and he's got helped families and players guide through that process for enough years now to help you. So if you're
I
interested in
appreciate it.
connecting with Sam, make sure you head to rocklandpeakperformance.com, check out the recruiting tab, reach out. I know he's willing to respond to any emails. Like I said, this is going to be something that we might not come out in full podcast form, but we're at least going to offer some insights occasionally as we go through the off season to provide information, especially for those families entering the 2027 spring, looking for guidance through the recruiting process. So make sure you smash that subscribe button and follow Sam on all social media channels, connect with us, and we can help you in any way. We're not going to sit there and guarantee that we'll reach out to the school of your dreams and connect you. But from a question and answer standpoint, you want a question, we'll provide our best answer and our best take on the perspective of the landscape. So Sam, I
For
really
sure.
appreciate it. Can't thank you enough,
Likewise.
as always. I always enjoy these conversations. I never once talked to you and not learned something. So took a ton of stuff away, and I hope our listeners did too.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Appreciate it, man.
Of course. Thank you. And that'll do for this episode of the Baseball Development Hub podcast.